"Choose any of my girls as payment," the father said. "I want the fat one," said the mountain man. The whole saloon went silent. A drunken gambler just sold his daughter to settle a card debt, and the stranger he owed didn't choose the pretty ones. He chose the one everyone mocked, the quiet, heavy-set girl trembling in the cold. But when the mountain man laid his gold on the table, he didn't take her for himself. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and said, "You're free now. Out in the wilderness, where snow and shame cut deep, two broken souls find each other, one hiding from the law, the other from the world's cruelty. Yet the lawman's coming, the father's demanding her back, and a secret buried in the mountains could destroy them both. In a land where mercy is rarer than gold, can compassion redeem the guilty, and teach the unloved she was never worthless at all? What happens when the man who bought her becomes the only one who truly sees her worth? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Silver Cross Saloon reeked of stale whiskey and broken dreams. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, curling around the oil lamps that cast yellow circles on the scarred wooden tables. Bo Creighton slumped in his chair, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the last silver dollar spinning on the green felt before him. When it finally toppled, the coin landed tails up. Another loss. "That's it then," the dealer said, sweeping the money away with practiced hands. "You're dry as desert dust, Creighton." Bo's fingers trembled as he patted his empty pockets. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the winter chill seeping through the window panes. The other players began collecting their winnings, ready to call it a night. That's when Bo's bleary gaze caught movement in the shadows, a tall figure standing against the back wall, silent as stone. "Wait," Bo slurred, desperation making his voice crack. "I ain't finished yet." He straightened up, tugging at his threadbare coat. "I got something else to wager." The stranger in the shadows shifted slightly. In the dim light, his weather-beaten face remained half-hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat, but his eyes glinted with sudden interest. Aidan McCord had been watching the game for hours, nursing a single cup of coffee gone cold. "My girls," Bo announced, his words drawing shocked murmurs from the crowd. "3 of 'em, waiting right outside. Fine stock, all of 'em." His laugh was hollow, echoing off the walls. "Take your pick, stranger. Anyone you fancy?" The saloon grew quiet as a church, save for the crackle of the wood stove in the corner. Several men turned away in disgust, while others leaned forward, morbidly curious to see what would happen next. The bartender stopped polishing glasses, his rag frozen mid-swipe. Aidan McCord pushed away from the wall, his spurs jingling softly as he stepped into the lamplight. His face was lined deep from years in the mountains, his broad shoulders carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to survive alone. Without a word, he walked to the entrance and pulled back the curtain. Outside, 3 young women huddled together on the boardwalk, their thin shawls offering little protection against the bitter night air. The eldest stood tall and proud, though her eyes betrayed her fear. The middle sister kept her gaze fixed on her boots, shoulders hunched against the shame of their father's latest scheme. And then there was Elena, round-faced and soft, trembling not just from the cold, but from the weight of knowing she was considered the least desirable of the 3. Aidan studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the saloon, boots creaking on the wooden floor as he approached Bo's table. From his vest pocket, he withdrew a small leather pouch and emptied its contents, a single gold nugget gleaming in the lamplight. "I want the fat one," he said, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the suddenly silent room. Bo blinked in surprise, then let out a harsh laugh. "Elena, hell, take her. She ain't good for nothing but eating up provisions anyway." He snatched the gold nugget, testing it with his teeth before shoving it into his pocket. Aiden walked back outside, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The three sisters clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces as they realized this wasn't just another of their father's empty threats. Elena's shoulders shook as she embraced her sisters one last time. "Don't cry for me," she whispered, trying to sound brave despite her quavering voice. Maybe this is God's way of setting me free." Aiden waited nearby, holding the reins of his pack mule. He didn't grab Elena's arm or rush her farewells. Instead, he simply nodded toward the animal, where a spare blanket was already laid across its back. Elena kissed her sister's cheeks, then walked toward him on unsteady legs. The town's few remaining night owls watched from their windows as Aiden lifted a lantern and started up the ridge road, Elena following a few steps behind. The snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching the light as they drifted down. Their footprints marked a path into the darkness, his steady and sure, hers hesitant but determined. Back in the saloon, Beau Creighton was already calling for another bottle, the gold nugget burning a hole in his pocket along with what remained of his conscience. But outside, in the growing silence of the winter night, something extraordinary was taking place. With each step away from town, Elena felt the invisible chains of her father's cruelty beginning to loosen. Aiden walked at a pace she could manage, occasionally turning to make sure she hadn't fallen behind. His lantern cast dancing shadows on the snow-dusted trail, lighting their way toward the high country where he made his home. Neither spoke. There would be time for words later. For now, the only sounds were their boots crunching in the snow and the soft jingling of the mule's harness. Elena pulled her thin shawl tighter, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Without a word, Aiden shrugged off his heavy wool coat and held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it with trembling hands. The warmth of the garment wrapped around her like an embrace, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine needles. The ridge road wound higher into the mountains, leaving the lights of town far below. Elena's legs ached from the climb, but she pressed on, drawing strength from a well deep inside her, the same strength that had helped her endure years of her father's casual cruelty and the town's sideways glances. She didn't know what waited at the end of this journey, but she knew it couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. As they crested a rise, Aiden paused, holding up the lantern. Through the gently falling snow, Elena could make out the dark shape of a cabin nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, promising warmth within. A small barn stood nearby, its weather-worn boards offering shelter to whatever animals this quiet man kept. "Home," Aiden said simply, the first word he'd spoken since leaving town. He gestured for Elena to follow him to the cabin's door. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth, casting warm light on the simple but well-kept interior. A narrow bed sat in one corner, its quilt neat and folded. A table held a few tin plates and cups, while shelves along the walls stored provisions and tools. Everything had its place, speaking to the ordered solitude of a man who'd chosen to live apart from others. Aiden hung the lantern on a hook and added wood to the fire. As the flames grew brighter, Elena stood uncertainly by the door, still wrapped in his coat. She watched as he moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, putting a pot of coffee on to boil and laying out bread and dried meat on the table. "Sit," he said, pulling out a sturdy chair. "Eat something." Elena sank into the chair, her legs grateful for the rest. As she reached for the food, her hand trembled slightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" Aiden paused in his tasks, regarding her with those quiet eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I reckon you deserved saving more than that gold was worth." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough in her life. Tears of shame when the town children mocked her size. Tears of fear when her father's drinking turned mean. Tears of loneliness when it seemed no one would ever see past her appearance to the person she was inside. But these tears were different. They came from a place of profound relief and budding hope. "Theo," coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer of white to the mountain world. Elena took a bite of bread, realizing how hungry she was. As she ate, Aiden moved about the cabin, gathering blankets and extra pillows to make up a pallet near the fire. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding to the makeshift bed. "I'll take the barn." Elena stopped chewing, surprised by this gesture of respect. In all her years, she'd grown used to expecting the worst from men. Her father had taught her that lesson well. But here was something different, a kindness offered without demands, a shelter given freely. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it for far more than just the sleeping arrangements. Aiden nodded once, then picked up his lantern. "Rest now," he said, moving toward the door. "Tomorrow's soon enough for figuring what comes next." As he stepped out into the snowy night, Elena sat in the warmth of his cabin, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew in her heart that this stranger's act of mercy had changed the course of her life forever. Through the window, she could see Aiden's lantern moving toward the barn, a steady point of light in the darkness. She offered up a silent prayer of gratitude, knowing that God sometimes worked in mysterious ways, even through gruff mountain men with gold nuggets and quiet hearts full of unexpected kindness. The mountain trail stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of white winding through the darkness. Elena sat behind Aiden on his horse, her body rigid with fear. Each step the animal took carried her further from everything she'd ever known, though little of it had been kind. The night air bit through her thin dress, and her tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting strange shadows on the snow. The creak of leather and the horse's steady breathing were the only sounds breaking the vast silence. Elena's thoughts whirled like the snowflakes around them. Had she truly been sold to this stranger? What fate awaited her at the end of this journey? Aiden hadn't spoken a word since they'd left town. His broad back blocked the worst of the wind, but Elena couldn't stop shivering. Her fingers, clutching the back of his coat, had long since gone numb. She tried to pray, but the words stuck in her throat, frozen like everything else in this wilderness. After what seemed like hours, Aiden reined the horse to a stop near a frozen creek. The water's voice was muted beneath its icy covering, but Elena could hear it singing faintly in the darkness. Bare trees stood guard along the banks, their branches reaching toward a sky scattered with hard, bright stars. "We'll rest here," Aiden said, his voice rough from disuse. He dismounted with practiced ease, then turned to help Elena. Down. Her legs had stiffened from the cold ride, and she stumbled as her feet touched the ground. Aiden's strong hand steadied her, then quickly let go. She watched, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as he moved with quiet efficiency to make camp. First, he secured the horse, then gathered fallen branches from beneath the snow. His movements were sure and practiced, speaking of countless nights spent in the wilderness. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling, its warmth reaching out like welcome hands. Elena edged closer to the flames, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Without a word, Aiden shrugged off his heavy coat and held it out to her. She stared at him, confusion written across her face. "But won't you be cold?" "I'm used to it," he said simply. Elena took the coat with trembling fingers. It was still warm from his body, and when she pulled it around her shoulders, it enveloped her like a fortress. The fabric carried the scent of wood smoke and pine needles, somehow comforting despite coming from a stranger. Aiden busied himself with his saddlebags, pulling out some dried meat and hard biscuits. He offered her a share, then sat on the opposite side of the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weather-worn face as he studied her. "You're safe," he said suddenly, his voice gruff but gentle. "You can ride back come daylight if you wish." Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What? I ain't keeping you against your will. Town's half a day's ride back that way." He gestured with his chin toward the trail they'd traveled. Before Elena could respond, a long, mournful howl echoed from the timberline. Another answered, closer, and then another. Wolves, hunting in the night. Elena instinctively scooted closer to the fire, her heart pounding. Aiden added more wood to the flames, making them leap higher. "They won't come near the fire," he assured her, but she noticed how his hand rested on the rifle beside him. The wolves called to each other again, their voices carrying through the crisp mountain air. Elena pulled Aiden's coat tighter around herself, trying to make herself smaller. The night pressed in around their circle of firelight, full of unseen dangers. "I had a daughter once," Aiden said quietly, so quietly Elena wasn't sure at first if he'd spoken. "About your age she was." Elena watched him across the flames. His face had softened somehow, lost in memory. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Winter came early that year, caught us unprepared." His hands worked mechanically, feeding small sticks into the fire. "Game was scarce. Our supplies ran low. I hunted every day, but—" He fell silent, staring into the flames as if they held the rest of the story. "She starved," Elena said softly, understanding dawning in her heart. Aiden nodded once, sharply. Sarah was her name. She never complained, not once, just got quieter and quieter until— His voice trailed off, swallowed by the night. The wolves had gone silent, but Elena barely noticed. She studied the man across the fire with new eyes. This wasn't the cruel purchase she'd feared. This was something else entirely. A father's broken heart reaching out to save another child from harm. They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. Elena found herself growing drowsy despite her fears, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the heavy coat around her shoulders. Aiden showed her how to arrange pine boughs into a soft bed near the flames, then took up his position on the other side, his rifle close at hand. The night passed slowly. Elena dozed fitfully, waking often to find Aiden still awake, keeping watch. Each time she opened her eyes, she found the fire burning steady and strong, fed by his careful attention. The wolves didn't return, but other night sounds filled the darkness, the cry of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the soft whisper of snow falling from laden branches. As the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Elena woke to find Aiden kneeling at the edge of their camp. His head was bowed, hands clasped before him in prayer. The sight stopped her breath for a moment. This man, who seemed so much a part of the wild mountain landscape, was speaking to God with the same quiet reverence she felt in her own heart. Slowly, carefully, Elena rose from her bed of pine boughs. She moved to kneel beside him, folding her hands awkwardly in her lap. Though she couldn't hear his whispered words, she added her own silent prayer of thanksgiving. For survival, for safety, and for the unexpected kindness of a stranger who wasn't quite so strange anymore. Aiden's prayer ended, but he remained kneeling for a moment longer. When he finally stood, he gave Elena a small nod of acknowledgement, something like approval in his eyes. Together they began breaking camp as the sun crept over the eastern mountains, painting the snow-covered world in shades of rose and gold. The morning was crisp and clear, the storm having passed during the night. As Aiden saddled the horse, Elena stood warming her hands over the remains of their fire. She thought about his offer to return to town, to the life she'd known. Behind her lay familiar misery, her father's cruelty, the town's judgment, the weight of shame and fear she'd carried for so long. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. She watched Aiden's sure movements as he prepared for another day's journey, remembering his quiet prayer at dawn, his offered coat, his careful guardianship through the long night. Here was a man who had known profound loss, yet still reached out to help another. The sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Elena took a deep breath of the clean mountain air, feeling something shift inside her heart. When Aiden turned to her with a questioning look, she was ready with her answer. "I'd like to go with you," she said softly, but firmly. "If you'll have me." Aiden studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. He helped her mount behind him, and together they set off into the brightening day. The horse's hooves broke through the fresh snow with a rhythmic crunch, carrying them deeper into the mountains, toward whatever future God had in mind. Elena's tears had dried, replaced by a cautious hope. She wasn't being sold or taken, she was being saved. And though she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew that the man leading her through these mountains was guided by something stronger than grief, something holier than mere kindness. In shared prayer at dawn, she'd glimpsed the truth of him, and it gave her courage to face whatever waited at the trail's end. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered trail as Aiden's horse picked its way through the San Juan foothills. Elena's arms had grown stiff from holding on to the saddle horn, but she didn't dare complain. The terrain had grown steeper, the path narrower, winding between towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. Finally, Aiden pulled the horse to a stop at the crest of a ridge. "There," he said, pointing to a clearing below. Elena followed his gesture and saw a log cabin nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, dancing silver in the fading light. A small corral stood to one side, and she could make out what looked like a root cellar door set into the hillside. The horse picked its way carefully down the slope. As they drew closer, Elena took in more details. The cabin was sturdy-looking, built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss. A stack of split firewood lined one wall, and various animal pelts were stretched on frames to dry. It wasn't large, but something about it spoke of shelter, of safety. Aiden dismounted first, then helped Elena down. Her legs trembled beneath her after the long ride. He steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow until she found her footing. "Let me show you around," he said, leading the horse toward the corral. "It ain't much, but it's home." Elena followed him, taking in everything with wide eyes. The corral held another horse, a sturdy bay that nickered a greeting. A chicken coop stood nearby, though she saw no chickens yet, likely sheltering from the cold inside. The root cellar door was heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands. "Store supplies down there," Aiden explained, patting the cellar door. Keeps things from freezing in winter." He led her to the cabin itself, pushing open the heavy wooden door. Elena stepped inside and blinked as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. It was a single room, but neat and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting warm light across the plank floor. Pelts lined the walls, elk, deer, bear, providing both decoration and insulation. A rough-hewn table stood near the fireplace, 2 chairs pulled up to it. Simple shelves held cooking implements, books, and various supplies. Above, she saw a loft space accessed by a ladder where a bed was visible. Below it, near the fireplace, was a pile of blankets arranged as another sleeping place. "Loft's yours," Aiden said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "I'll sleep down here by the fire." Elena stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, still wearing his other coat. She didn't know what to do with herself in this strange new space. Aiden seemed to sense her discomfort. "Best get the supplies inside before dark," he said, heading back out to the horse. Grateful for something to do, Elena followed him. Together they unloaded the saddlebags and various bundles tied to the horse's back. She carried what she could manage while Aiden handled the heavier items. Back and forth they went, working in companionable silence until everything was inside. The physical activity helped ease some of Elena's tension. As she helped put supplies away, dried beans, coffee, salt pork, ammunition, she began to feel less like an intruder and more like someone with a purpose, however small. Aiden moved around the cabin with the ease of long habit, starting a pot of stew over the fire and checking various pelts hanging to cure. Elena watched him surreptitiously, noting how he seemed more comfortable here than he had in town. The stiff set of his shoulders had relaxed somewhat, and his movements were sure and practiced. As the stew began to simmer, filling the cabin with savory smells, Elena's gaze was drawn to the mantel above the fireplace. Among the usual objects, a tin cup, some ammunition, a few tools, stood a single photograph in a simple wooden frame. She found herself moving closer to study it. The photograph showed a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, smiling broadly at the camera. Beside her stood a woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back from her face. The girl must be Sarah, Aiden's daughter who had died. Elena's heart ached at the happiness captured in that moment, knowing how it had ended. "That's the last picture taken of them." Aiden's voice came quietly from behind her. "Sarah and her mother, Mary." Elena jumped slightly. She hadn't heard him approach. "They're beautiful," she said softly. Aiden made a sound that might have been agreement or pain, then moved away to check the stew. Elena remained by the fireplace for a moment longer, studying the photograph. She wondered what Sarah had been like, what dreams and hopes she'd carried. What kind of father had Aiden been to her? The man in the photograph, barely visible at the edge of the frame, looked younger, less weathered by grief. The day's journey had worn Elena out more than she realized. She found herself swaying slightly on her feet, exhaustion sweeping over her in waves. Aiden noticed and gestured toward the ladder leading to the loft. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll wake you when the stew's ready." Elena climbed carefully up to the loft. The bed there was simple but clean, covered, with warm quilts and soft furs. She sank onto it gratefully, her tired muscles relaxing into the softness. From this vantage point, she could see most of the cabin below, while remaining partially hidden herself. She watched as Aiden moved about, tending to various tasks with quiet efficiency. The sound of the fire crackling and the pot bubbling created a soothing atmosphere. Despite her uncertainty about her situation, Elena felt her eyes growing heavy. She didn't mean to fall asleep, but the next thing she knew, Aiden was calling her name softly from below. She climbed down to find a tin plate of steaming stew waiting on the table. Aiden had already eaten his portion and was pulling on his coat. "Eat," he said, checking his rifle. "I'll take the night watch." "Night watch?" Elena asked, confused. "Bears sometimes come around this time of year, looking for easy meals before winter sets in proper. Need to make sure they don't get too curious about the horses or supplies." He headed for the door, then paused. "You'll be safe in here. Door locks from the inside." With that, he stepped out into the gathering darkness, leaving Elena alone in the cabin. She sat at the table, looking at the plate of stew. The aroma made her stomach growl. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. But before she picked up her spoon, she found herself folding her hands in her lap, bowing her head slightly. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "For this food, for shelter." She hesitated, then added, "and for sending someone to help me." It had been years since she'd said grace over a meal. Her father had forbidden it, claiming God had abandoned them when their mother died. But here, in this quiet cabin with its single photograph of lost loved ones, prayer felt right again. Natural, like drawing breath. The stew was simple but filling. Chunks of venison, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. Elena ate slowly, savoring each bite. Through the cabin's small window, she could occasionally see Aiden's lantern moving as he made his rounds, a steady presence in the darkness. When she finished eating, she washed her plate in a basin of water near the fire, then added more wood to the flames as she'd seen Aiden do. The familiar tasks helped settle her mind, giving her hands something to do while her thoughts wandered. What would tomorrow bring? What was expected of her here? She looked around the cabin again, seeing it with new eyes. There was work to be done, cooking, cleaning, mending. She knew how to do these things. Perhaps she could make herself useful, earn her keep until what? Elena pushed the question away for now. She was too tired to think that far ahead. Instead, she climbed back up to the loft and burrowed under the quilts. The bed smelled of cedar and clean air, nothing like her musty mattress back home. From her position in the loft, she could still see the photograph on the mantel, barely visible in the firelight. The smiling girl and her mother seemed to watch over the cabin, their frozen happiness a reminder of both loss and love. Elena thought about Aiden out there in the darkness, standing guard not just against bears, but against all the dangers and sorrows of the world. The fire popped and settled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. Elena pulled the quilts closer around herself, feeling strangely secure despite her uncertain circumstances. Perhaps it was the solid logs surrounding her, or the knowledge that someone was keeping watch. Or maybe it was simply that here, in this isolated cabin with its ghosts and its grief, she had found something she'd been missing for far too long. The chance to start anew. She drifted off to sleep with the taste of stew still on her tongue and the echo of her whispered prayer in her heart. Outside, Aiden's lantern continued its steady circuit, a beacon of light in the mountain darkness. 2 days passed like water flowing in the creek, steady and somehow peaceful. Elena had begun finding her place in the cabin's routines, learning where things belonged and how Aiden preferred them arranged. The morning of the 3rd day, she woke to the sound of boots on the wooden floor below. Peering over the edge of the loft, she saw Aiden pulling on his heavy coat. "Need to ride down to Silver Cross," he said, noticing her movement. "Running low on coffee and salt. Won't be gone more than half a day." Elena nodded, trying to hide her unease at being left alone. "I'll tend the fire," she offered. "Much obliged." He checked his rifle, then paused at the door. "Bar it behind me. Don't open for anyone but me." The morning passed slowly as Elena swept the cabin floor and organized the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Every so often she found herself glancing out the window, watching the path that led down to town. In Silver Cross, Aidan tied his mule outside the general store. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and conversation stopped dead. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, clutched her shawl tighter and hurried to the back room. Two women at the counter turned away, whispering behind their hands. "Heard you bought yourself a woman," Tom Peterson said flatly as he measured out coffee beans. His usual friendly manner was nowhere to be seen. Aidan's jaw tightened. "I helped someone who needed helping," he said quietly. "Nothing more to it than that." "Not what folks are saying." Peterson wouldn't meet his eyes. "Marshall's been asking questions about you." As if summoned by the words, the door chimed again. Marshall Clay Hollis stood in the doorway, his badge catching the weak winter sunlight. He was a tall man with hard eyes and a carefully trimmed mustache, every inch of him radiating authority. "McCord," he said, voice cold as mountain snow. "Been meaning to have a word." Aidan turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Marshall." "Interesting thing happened while looking into this business with Bo Creighton's daughter." Hollis moved further into the store, boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Name came up in connection with an unresolved killing near Rico. Must be, 7 years back now." The store grew so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Aidan felt the familiar weight of guilt settle in his chest, but kept his face neutral. "That so?" "Mining dispute, they say. Man ended up dead." Hollis studied him with the patient eyes of a hunter. "Never did find who did it." "Lot of mining disputes back then," Aidan said carefully. "Lot of men died." "Indeed," Hollis adjusted his gun belt. "Thing is, McCord, I don't much care for loose ends, or men who take the law into their own hands, whether it's 7 years ago or 3 days ago." The threat hung in the air between them. Aidan paid for his supplies without another word, aware of every eye in the store following him. As he loaded his saddlebags, he could feel Hollis watching from the boardwalk. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than usual, each step of his mule's hooves matching the heavy beating of his heart. Dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising snow. Elena had soup warming on the stove when Aidan returned. One look at his face told her something was wrong. He stowed the supplies mechanically, movements stiff with tension. "What happened in town?" she asked finally, when the silence grew too heavy. Aidan stood at the window for a long moment, watching the first snowflakes begin to fall. When he turned, his eyes were haunted. "You deserve to know the truth," he said quietly, "about who you're living with." Elena sat down at the rough wooden table, folding her hands in her lap. "Tell me then." 7 years ago, I was working a silver mine near Rico." His voice was low, weighted with memory. "There was a foreman, mean sort, liked to short the men's pay, work them past exhaustion. One day he caught a young boy, couldn't have been more than 16, trying to take some ore. Instead of turning him in, he decided to teach him a lesson." Aidan's hands clenched on the window frame. "I found them behind the assay office. The boy was already bloody. Foreman had a knife." He closed his eyes. "I tried to stop it. Words first, then fists. But he came at me with that knife, and I—" He swallowed hard. "I killed him. Broke his neck in the fight." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the snow was falling faster now, thick white flakes that would soon blanket the world. "The boy ran," Aidan continued finally. "Can't blame him. I ran too. Changed my name, came up here to trap instead. Been carrying it ever since." He waited for Elena's reaction. for the fear or disgust he expected to see on her face. But when she spoke, her voice was soft with understanding. "You fed me when no one else would," she said simply. "Gave me shelter when my own father cast me aside. Those aren't the actions of an evil man." Aiden's shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had shifted slightly. "Marshall's asking questions now. Won't be long before he puts it together." "Then we'll face it together," Elena said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "God doesn't abandon his children, even when they lose their way. Maybe he led you to that poker game for a reason." Through the window, they could see the snow falling more heavily now, beginning to obscure the path down the mountain. By morning, the drifts would be deep enough to cut them off from town until spring thaw. Aiden stirred the fire, adding another log. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. "Won't be able to get down the mountain now," he said. "Not till spring." Elena nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. They were bound together now, not just by circumstance, but by shared secrets and growing trust. Whatever came with the spring thaw, they would weather the winter together in this small cabin, with its photograph of lost loved ones and its slowly healing hearts. The snow continued to fall outside, erasing their tracks and covering the world in clean white silence. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Elena began preparing their evening meal, moving with growing confidence in what was becoming her kitchen, too. Aiden watched her for a moment, then went to check on the horses one last time before the storm sealed them in for the winter. In the growing darkness, the cabin's windows glowed like warm eyes against the swirling snow, a beacon of hope and sanctuary in the wilderness. Whatever judgment waited in town below, up here they had found something neither had expected: understanding, acceptance, and the first fragile shoots of trust beginning to grow in soil that had long lain fallow. The wind whistled around the eaves, carrying the promise of a long winter ahead. But for the first time in years, neither Aiden nor Elena faced that prospect with dread. Sometimes, they were both learning. Isolation could be a gift, time to heal, to learn each other's ways, to find redemption in small daily acts of kindness and care. As night fell completely, the snow continued its steady dance, wrapping the cabin in a soft white blanket that would keep them safe until spring brought its own challenges. But those were concerns for another day. For now, there was warm soup, the comfort of companionship, and the gentle persistence of hope taking root in unexpected soil. The blizzard settled over the cabin like a smothering blanket, piling snow against the walls and howling through every crack. Elena stood at the window, watching white flakes swirl past in an endless dance. The world beyond the glass had vanished into a pale void. "We'll need more wood," Aiden said from behind her, his voice barely audible over the storm's keening. "Pile's getting low." Elena turned from the window, squaring her shoulders. "I can help." Aiden paused in his work at the table, where pieces of steel traps lay spread before him like a puzzle. His weathered hands, stained with oil, went still. "Storm's fierce." "I'm stronger than I look," Elena said, lifting her chin. She'd spent too many years being told what she couldn't do. After a long moment, Aiden nodded. "Woodpile's round back, axe is by the door. Don't go far." Elena pulled on Aiden's spare coat, the worn leather engulfing her frame. The familiar scents of pine sap and tobacco wrapped around her like a second layer of warmth. She tied a rope from the cabin door to her waist, a precaution against getting lost in the whiteout conditions. The blast of cold as she stepped outside stole her breath. Snow immediately peppered her face, the wind cutting through every layer. Elena trudged through knee-deep drifts to the woodpile, her boots leaving deep impressions that filled almost as quickly as she made them. The axe felt awkward and heavy in her gloved hands. She positioned a log on the chopping block, remembered watching the stable hands do this back home. Taking a deep breath, she raised the axe high and brought it down. The blade stuck halfway through the log, jarring her arms. Elena tugged it free, tried again, and again. Her strikes were clumsy, but gradually she found a rhythm. The physical effort warmed her despite the bitter cold. Through the cabin's frosted window, Aidan watched while his hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of cleaning and repairing his traps. The steel teeth needed regular maintenance to prevent rust, especially in weather like this. But his attention kept straying to Elena's determined figure in the swirling snow. She wasn't skilled with the axe, but she was persistent. Each log eventually surrendered to her steady effort. There was something about her quiet determination that stirred memories of his daughter. Not the painful ones of her final days, but earlier times, watching her learn to ride or helping him set snares with tiny, careful hands. When Elena finally came back inside, her cheeks were red with cold and effort, but her eyes shone with accomplishment. She stamped snow from her boots and hung up the coat, which had collected a crust of ice. "Much obliged for the help," Aidan said gruffly, not looking up from his work. Elena smiled, warming her hands by the stove. "Least I can do, though I reckon it'll take me a while to get better at it." The days began to blend together as the storm raged on. They fell into a quiet routine, moving around each other in the small cabin space with growing familiarity. Elena learned the rhythm of frontier life, the constant work needed just to survive. Each morning, she rose early to help feed the mule in its sheltered lean-to. The animal's breath came in great white clouds as it munched contentedly on hay. Elena found herself talking to it softly, sharing her thoughts as she had with the horses back home. Inside, she tended the fire and cooked their simple meals. Beans featured heavily in their diet, supplemented by dried meat and what remained of the root cellar's stores. Elena experimented with the limited ingredients, adding pinches of precious dried herbs to vary the flavors. Aidan continued his work with the traps, his calloused fingers moving with practiced precision as he adjusted springs and tested mechanisms. Sometimes he would explain what he was doing, his quiet voice barely carrying over the storm's constant background roar. In the afternoons, they often sat together at the rough wooden table, reading from Aidan's worn Bible. The leather cover was cracked and soft with age, the pages dog-eared and marked with pressed leaves. Elena's finger traced the familiar words, finding comfort in their eternal wisdom. "My mother taught me to read with this same book," she said one day, touching a passage gently. Before she passed, Aidan nodded, understanding in his silence. Loss was a language they both spoke fluently. As darkness fell early each day, Aidan began teaching Elena how to handle his single-action revolver. "For safety," he explained, showing her how to check if it was loaded. "Need to know how to protect yourself out here." Elena's fingers fumbled with the cartridges at first, dropping them on the floor. She laughed at her own clumsiness, and the sound seemed to surprise them both, bright and unexpected in the storm-wrapped cabin. The corner of Aidan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Takes practice," he said. "Took me near a month to load smooth when I first started." On the fourth night, when the wind reached a fever pitch that made the cabin's timbers groan, Elena found herself remembering a hymn her mother used to sing. Without thinking, she began to hum it softly as she stirred the beans for supper. The familiar melody rose above the storm's howl. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice was untrained but true, carrying the old words with gentle reverence. Aiden sat in his chair by the fire, eyes closed, listening. The tune seemed to fill the cabin with something warm and intangible, like sunlight through stained glass. When Elena finished, the silence felt different, softer somehow, despite the raging storm outside. "Been a long while since I heard that," Aiden said finally, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. Elena nodded, understanding. Sometimes the old songs could reach places words couldn't touch, could heal wounds too deep for medicine. On the 5th day, they woke to an unusual silence. The storm's voice had finally stilled. Elena opened the cabin door to find a transformed world, everything smoothed and softened under a thick blanket of snow. The morning sun struck crystal fire from every surface, almost too bright to look at. The forest stood hushed and white, branches bowed under their heavy burden. Even the mules' lean-to had become a graceful snow cave. Their wood-chopping area was completely buried, only the handle of the axe, visible above the drifts. "Never seen anything so beautiful," Elena breathed, her words forming white puffs in the crystal air. Aiden came to stand beside her in the doorway, surveying the gleaming landscape. "Storms broke," he said quietly. "We made it through." They had done more than just survive, Elena realized. Somewhere in those 5 days of shared work and quiet companionship, something had shifted between them. Fear had melted away like snow in sunshine, leaving behind the first tender shoots of trust. They stood together a moment longer, watching the sun rise over their white-wrapped world. The air was so clear it hurt to breathe, sharp with pine and possibility. Despite the deep cold, Elena felt warm, not just from the cabin's fire, but from something deeper, something that had begun to grow in her heart during those storm-bound days. It was a warmth built of small moments, Aiden's patient hands showing her how to hold the revolver, the quiet companionship of shared meals, the way he had listened with closed eyes to her mother's hymn. Like the first green shoots pushing through spring soil, hope had begun to take root in unexpected places. The sun climbed higher, setting the snow-covered world ablaze with diamond light. Soon they would need to dig out paths to the woodpile and the mules' shelter to begin again the daily work of survival. But for now, they simply stood in the doorway of their shared sanctuary, watching the morning paint the world in shades of promise. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Aiden and Elena set out to check the trap line. Fresh powder crunched beneath their boots as they made their way along the creek, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. Elena wrapped her borrowed wool scarf tighter, grateful for its warmth against the biting cold. Aiden moved with practiced efficiency, checking each trap with careful hands. Elena watched, learning. She had insisted on coming along, wanting to understand more about the life that sustained them through the harsh mountain winters. "Look here," Aiden said, pointing to tracks in the snow. "Rabbit passed through but didn't trigger the trap." His voice was quiet, as always, but held a teacher's patience. Elena knelt to study the delicate impressions. "They're so small," she marveled. "How do you—" She stopped suddenly, head tilted. "Did you hear that?" Aiden straightened, instantly alert. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. A whimper carried on the wind. They found him in a hollow beneath a snow-laden pine. A boy, no more than 10 years old, his dark eyes huge in a face drawn tight with cold and fear. His clothes, though well made from deer hide, were frozen stiff. In his small hands, he clutched a broken arrow like a talisman. "He's Ute," Aiden said quietly, recognition and concern mixing in his voice. Elena was already shrugging off her coat. "He'll freeze to death if we leave him," she said, wrapping the coat around the boy's shoulders. His skin felt like ice beneath her touch. "We have to help him." Aiden's weathered face showed his internal struggle. "Harboring an Indian child could bring trouble. Army's been burning Ute camps, forcing them onto reservation land. If they find him with us—" "Please," Elena said softly. She looked up at Aiden, her eyes full of the same determination he'd seen when she chopped wood in the blizzard. "We can't let him die." The boy watched them with wary eyes, shivering violently. Elena hummed softly, a gentle sound like she might use to calm a frightened horse. Slowly, the fear in the child's face eased slightly. Aiden sighed, his breath a white plume in the cold air. Then he stepped forward and carefully lifted the boy in his arms. The child was light, too light, and his small body trembled like an aspen leaf in the wind. "Hold on, little one," Elena murmured, as Aiden placed the boy on his horse. She climbed up behind him, holding him secure against her warmth. The broken arrow remained clutched in his frozen fingers. The ride back to the cabin seemed endless. Elena kept up a steady stream of gentle words, though the boy showed no sign of understanding English. His shivering gradually lessened as her body heat seeped through the layers of clothing between them. Inside the cabin, they worked quickly. Elena wrapped the boy in warm blankets, while Aiden built up the fire. Soon the kettle was steaming, filling the small space with the rich smell of beef broth. "Small sips," Elena instructed, holding the cup to the boy's lips. He drank cautiously at first, then with more eagerness as the warmth spread through him. Color slowly returned to his face. After the broth, the boy's eyes grew heavy. Elena settled him near the fire, tucking the blankets around him securely. He watched their movements with tired wariness, but exhaustion soon won out. His breathing deepened into sleep, though his hand still gripped the broken arrow. As evening approached, Elena sat beside the sleeping child, humming softly, the same hymn she had sung during the blizzard. Aiden paused in his work to listen, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The boy's face had relaxed in sleep, looking suddenly very young and vulnerable. Aiden remembered his own daughter at that age, how small she had seemed in her bed during her final illness. The memory, usually so painful, felt different now, softened somehow by the presence of this child who needed their help. "He tried to say something earlier," Elena said quietly, breaking into Aiden's thoughts. "It sounded like Tiva, might be his name." Aiden nodded, studying the boy's face. "Tiva," he repeated softly. The name felt right somehow. Outside, snow began to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the window in the gathering dusk. Elena continued her gentle humming, the melody weaving through the comfortable sounds of the cabin, the crack of the fire, the whisper of falling. Snow, the quiet breathing of the sleeping child. Aiden moved to the window, watching the snow transform the world once again. His thoughts were troubled. Harboring a Ute child was dangerous, for them and for the boy. The army patrols had been increasingly aggressive in their treatment of the native people, forcing them from their traditional hunting grounds, if they were discovered. But looking back at Elena tending to the boy with such gentle care, Aiden felt something else pushing back against his fear. Hope, he realized with surprise. Hope that doing what was right might matter more than doing what was safe. As full darkness settled outside, Aiden did something he hadn't done since his daughter died. He knelt beside his bed and prayed aloud. "Lord," he began hesitantly, his voice rough with disuse. "I ain't been much for talking to you these past years. Reckon I was too angry. too full of hurt. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But this boy needs help, and Elena. She seen clear what needed doing when I was too scared to act. Give us wisdom, Lord. And thank you for sending them both. Elena's humming had stopped. In the silence, Aiden could hear her quiet, Amen. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Tiva slept on, his face peaceful in the dancing light. The broken arrow had finally slipped from his grasp, lying beside him like a forgotten toy. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping their small cabin in a blanket of white. Inside, the warmth of the fire and something more, something like family, held the cold at bay. They had no way of knowing what challenges the morning would bring. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. They were together. Elena reached down and gently smoothed Tiva's dark hair, an instinctively maternal gesture. We'll need to make him some warm clothes, she said softly, and teach him English, I suppose. Aiden nodded, already mentally cataloging what supplies they would need. Come spring, we'll have to figure something more permanent, he said. But for now, he didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. For now, they would protect this child who had been placed in their care. For now, they would be the family he needed. For now, they would trust that doing what was right would somehow see them through. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light over the sleeping boy and the two people who had chosen to risk everything to save him. Outside, the snow fell steadily, erasing all tracks that might have led to their door, as if nature herself approved of their decision and wished to protect their secret. The morning after finding Tiva, Aiden stood at the cabin door, buckling his gun belt. Frost painted delicate patterns on the window panes, and his breath hung in white clouds as he spoke. The boy's fever's rising. He needs medicine. Proper medicine. Elena nodded, wringing out a cool cloth by the wash basin. How long to the Indian Agency? 2 days' hard ride, if the weather holds. Aiden's eyes flickered to Tiva, who lay bundled in blankets near the fire, his small face flushed with fever. Keep the doors barred. Don't answer for anyone. Elena pressed the damp cloth to Tiva's forehead. We'll manage. God will watch over us. Aiden paused, his hand on the door latch. The faith in her voice still surprised him sometimes. I'll ride fast as I can, he said gruffly, and then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with their unexpected charge. The first day passed slowly. Elena kept the fire well fed and tended to Tiva with quiet determination. Though he spoke little English, his dark eyes followed her movements with growing trust. When she brought him water or broth, he would touch his chest and make a gentle gesture toward the sun, then point to what seemed like home. By the second day, Tiva's fever had broken enough that he could sit up. Elena was stirring a pot of beans when he suddenly spoke. Hesitant words in broken English mixed with his native tongue. Through patience and careful attention to his gestures, she began to understand his story. Soldiers? She asked gently, when he pantomimed men with guns. Tiva nodded, his face growing solemn. He used sticks from the kindling pile to show a lodge, his family's winter home near Pagosa Creek. Then he knocked the sticks apart, making a sound like crackling flames. His eyes filled with tears as he pointed to where the sun rises, showing how his people had scattered, running from the burning lodge. Elena's heart ached. She gathered him close, and this time he didn't pull away. You're safe now, she whispered, though she knew the promise was bigger than her power to keep it. You're safe. The cabin door rattled late that afternoon, making them both jump. But it was only Aiden, snow-dusted and weary, with precious medicines from the agency doctor wrapped in his saddlebags. Elena met him at the door, relief washing over her face. Thank the Lord you're back safe. Aiden shrugged off his coat, his movements stiff from the cold ride. His eyes went straight to Tiva, assessing. Fever's down some? Yes, and he's been talking. Aiden... Elena's voice grew urgent. We have to keep him, at least until spring. The soldiers burned his family's lodge, scattered them all to the winds. He has nowhere else to go. Aiden's weathered face showed the weight of this request. Harboring a native child could bring the worst kind of trouble. Not just from the law, but from settlers who viewed all Indians as enemies. Yet when he looked at Elena's determined expression, he saw the same spirit that had faced down winter storms without complaint. It ain't just about us anymore, he said slowly. Every person who comes to trade, every patrol that passes, we'd be risking his life as much as ours. Then we'll make a safe place, Elena insisted. Somewhere to hide him if anyone comes. Aiden was quiet for a long moment, studying the boy who watched them with such solemn eyes. Finally, he nodded. The root cellar needs expanding anyway. We can dig a warm space beneath the cabin floor. They began work that very evening. While Elena kept Tiva occupied with simple English lessons, Aiden pulled up the floorboards near the back wall. The earth beneath was frozen, but workable. Hour by hour, he dug deeper, carefully bracing the walls with spare boards and creating a small chamber just big enough for a child to hide comfortably. Elena lined the space with their warmest furs and extra blankets. She added a small box of dried meat and hard biscuits, a water skin, and most precious of all, a stub of candle and matches sealed in a tin. So he won't have to wait in the dark, she explained softly. That night, as they sat around the fire, Tiva did something unexpected. He knelt by the hearth and began drawing in the wood ash with his finger. First came people, tall figures holding the hands of a smaller one. Then horses, running free under an enormous sun. Your family? Elena asked gently. Tiva nodded, adding more details to the figures. The woman wore a special necklace, the man carried a bow. In the ash drawings, they were smiling. Elena felt Aiden shift beside her, his eyes fixed on the child's artwork. She knew he was seeing another family, his own lost wife and daughter, perhaps drawn just this way in happier times. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. After a moment's hesitation, his rough fingers closed around hers. The simple action seemed to break some invisible barrier. Aiden cleared his throat. Reckon it's time to eat, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. He reached for the fresh bread Elena had baked that morning, a luxury saved for special occasions. They gathered around the small table, the firelight casting warm shadows on their faces. Elena bowed her head to say, "Grace," and this time both Aiden and Tiva folded their hands without prompting. Lord, she prayed softly, thank you for bringing us together, for making us a family when we were all alone. Watch over those who are lost and scattered, and help us to be worthy of this trust you've given us. She squeezed Aiden's hand gently. Amen. Amen, Aiden echoed, and Tiva, catching on, repeated the word carefully. They passed the bread between them, steam rising from its golden crust. Tiva broke his piece carefully, offering half to Elena in a gesture that needed no translation. She accepted with a smile, her heart full. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like a flower opening to the sun. They had chosen a dangerous path, Elena knew. Every day would bring new risks, new fears to overcome. But looking at Tiva's peaceful face in the firelight, at Aiden's quiet strength beside her, she felt certain of their decision. This was what faith looked like. Not just prayers and scripture, but love made real through action. God had given them a chance to do what was right, no matter the cost. And in doing so, he had given them something precious in return. A family, gathered around this humble table, sharing bread and trust and hope. The fire crackled softly, and Tiva's ash drawings slowly faded on the hearth. But the bonds forming between these three lonely souls grew stronger with each passing moment, like roots reaching deep into fertile soil, ready to weather whatever storms might come. The late winter sun cast long shadows across Aiden's cabin as Elena kneaded bread dough on the rough-hewn table. Her movements were steady, practiced now after months of frontier living. Tiva sat cross-legged by the hearth, carefully stringing wooden beads onto a leather cord. A gift he was making for her, the peaceful rhythm of their afternoon shattered when hoofbeats thundered up the trail. Elena's hands froze in the dough. Aiden was already moving, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Under the floor," he commanded softly, lifting the hidden trap door they'd built beneath the bearskin rug. Tiva disappeared into the space without a sound, well practiced from their drills. The thud of the door closing barely echoed before heavy boots struck the porch. 3 sharp knocks rattled the cabin door. "United States Marshal." The voice was authoritative, unmistakable. Clay Hollis had come calling. Aiden shot Elena a warning look as he moved to answer. She quickly covered the bread dough with a cloth, trying to still her trembling hands. When the door swung open, Marshal Hollis filled the frame, flanked by 2 deputies. His badge caught the wan sunlight as he stepped inside, spurs jingling against the floorboards. "McCord," he said, nodding curtly. His keen eyes swept the cabin's interior before settling on Elena. "Miss Creighton, just checking to ensure your situation remains satisfactory." Elena straightened her apron, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Marshal Hollis, would you care for coffee?" The marshal's mouth twitched, almost approving. "Much obliged, ma'am." While Elena busied herself at the cook stove, the tension in the room grew thick as morning fog. Aiden remained by the door, his stance casual but ready. The deputies lingered awkward and uncertain, hands never far from their holsters. "Seems you've made quite a home here," Hollis observed, accepting the tin cup Elena offered. His boot scraped across the floor, right where Tiva lay hidden, and Elena's heart nearly stopped. But the marshal merely settled himself in the room's only chair, apparently noticing nothing amiss. "We manage," Aiden said quietly. Hollis sipped his coffee, studying them both over the rim. "Word's come down from Rico," he said finally. "That mine owner you had trouble with, Harrison, he's still mighty interested in settling old scores." Elena's fingers tightened around her own cup. She'd learned the full story of the mine killing during the long winter nights. How Harrison had worked his men past exhaustion, how young Tommy Jenkins had fallen and broken his leg, how Harrison had ordered him back into the unstable shaft anyway. When Aiden intervened, Harrison had pulled a knife. The killing had been self-defense, pure and simple, but Harrison's money spoke louder than truth in Rico's court. "That business is long done," Aiden said, his voice level. "Maybe." Hollis set his cup down with a sharp click. "But Harrison's got friends in the territorial government now, been making noise about reopening the case." His eyes narrowed. "Might be wise to consider moving on. Both of you." Elena stepped forward, her voice stronger than she felt. "This is our home, Marshal." Hollis's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her. "No offense meant, ma'am. Just passing along friendly warning." He stood, adjusting his gun belt. "Though I admit, I'm curious why folks who claim to want privacy get so many Indian tracks around their property." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's pulse roared in her ears, but she forced herself to keep wiping the same plate, over and over. Aiden hadn't moved a muscle. Game's been scarce this winter, he said finally. Utes probably following the same deer we are? Hollis nodded slowly. Probably so. He gestured to his deputies. We'll be riding through regular now spring's coming. Keep an eye out for any trouble. The threat in his words was clear as mountain air. Elena's hands shook as she gathered the coffee cups, but her voice remained steady. Safe journey, Marshal. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely did Aiden move to the trap door. Tiva emerged like a shadow, his face solemn but unafraid. Elena's legs finally gave way, and she sank onto the bearskin rug, trembling. Aiden knelt beside her, his weathered hand covering hers. They won't take you, he promised fiercely. Either of you. Elena leaned into his strength, letting out a shaky breath. I know. She squeezed his fingers. We're family now. All of us. Tiva pressed close to her other side, offering the half-finished beaded necklace like a talisman of protection. Elena pulled him into a tight embrace, breathing in the pine smoke scent of his hair. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, throwing golden light across the cabin's worn floorboards. A steady drip, drip, drip drew their attention to the window. The icicles that had adorned the eaves all winter were finally melting, releasing their frozen grip one drop at a time. Spring was coming, ready or not, bringing mud and green shoots and longer days. And danger, Elena thought, watching water trickle down the glass. The marshal's warning echoed in her mind. Harrison's influence could reach them even here, and Hollis's suspicious questions about Indian signs meant Tiva's presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Their peaceful winter isolation was ending. But as she looked at Aiden's determined face, at Tiva's trusting eyes, she felt her fear give way to something stronger. This was what faith meant. Not just believing, but standing firm when trials came. God had brought them, together, 3 wounded souls, and made them whole. Whatever storms approached, they would weather them together. The last rays of sun painted the cabin walls with amber light. Tiva returned to his beadwork by the fire, his small fingers moving surely now. Aiden checked the priming on his rifle before setting it back in its place of honor, above the mantel. Elena rose to uncover her bread dough, which had risen despite the interruption. Life would go on. They would be cautious, vigilant, ready to protect what they'd built. But they would also continue living, baking bread, teaching Tiva his letters, reading scripture by lamplight, sharing simple meals around their humble table. These ordinary moments were precious gifts, all the more valuable for their fragility. As Elena shaped the dough into loaves, she heard Aiden begin teaching Tiva how to say the Lord's Prayer in English, their voices blending in the quiet cabin. Outside, another icicle crashed to the ground, and in its place, a single drop of water caught the fading sunlight, brilliant as hope. The first warm wind of spring whistled through the valley, carrying the promise of thaw. Elena stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching winter's grip loosen on the land. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the snow like islands in a white sea. The afternoon sun felt stronger now, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark trilled its return. She breathed deeply, savoring the fresh scent of melting snow and awakening earth. Behind her, Tiva practiced his letters at the rough-hewn table while Aiden mended traps by the hearth. These peaceful moments had become precious to her, like pearls on a string of quiet days. The crack of a branch snapped her attention to the trail. A horse's whinny echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone cursing. Elena's heart seized. She knew that voice. "Pa," she whispered, the word falling like a stone. Aiden was on his feet instantly, moving Tiva toward the trap door with practiced efficiency. The boy disappeared without a sound, just as Bo Creighton's horse emerged from the tree line. Elena's father sat askew in his saddle, his clothes trail-stained, and his face flushed with what she recognized as the aftermath of whiskey. "Girl!" Bo's shout carried across the yard. "Elena, get out here!" Aiden stepped forward, but Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let me," she said softly. Drawing herself up, she walked onto the porch, feeling the solid planks beneath her feet like anchors. Bo dismounted clumsily, nearly losing his balance. He looked older than Elena remembered, more worn, but his eyes still held that familiar mix of self-righteousness and blame. "There you are," he growled, stumbling forward. "Time to come home." "This is my home now," Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Bo's face darkened. "Like hell it is. No bargain made drunk can stand in law." He jabbed a finger toward Aiden, who had moved to stand quietly behind Elena. "You think you can buy my flesh and blood with a chunk of gold? That ain't proper, ain't Christian." A bitter laugh almost escaped Elena's throat. How many times had her father invoked Christianity when it suited him, while forgetting its teachings in his daily life? She thought of all the nights she'd gone hungry while he drank away their money, all the times she'd hidden her sisters from his rages. "You lost more than cards that night," she said, meeting his gaze squarely. "You lost your honor." Bo reeled back as if she'd struck him. "Honor?" he spat. "What honor is there in living like a mountain man's woman? What would your poor mama say?" "Mama would say I'm finally free." Elena's voice gained strength with each word. "Free from hunger, free from fear, free from watching you destroy everything she built." "Why, you ungrateful?" Bo lurched forward, hand raised. Aiden's movement was subtle but clear, a slight shift of weight, a hand moving toward his belt. Bo froze, suddenly remembering who he faced. The mountain man's reputation was well known in Silver Cross. "I'll bring the marshal," Bo sneered, backing away. "He'll sort this out proper. You can't keep what ain't yours to keep." "I belong to no one," Elena said firmly. "Not you, not any man." Bo spat in the dirt, fumbling his way back to his horse. "We'll see about that." He managed to mount, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't finished." They watched him ride away, weaving slightly in the saddle. Only when he disappeared into the trees did Elena realize she was trembling. Aiden's hand touched her shoulder, gentle as falling snow. "You all right?" She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The confrontation had left her drained but somehow lighter, as if speaking her truth had lifted a great weight from her spirit. Aiden helped her inside, where Tiva emerged from hiding to press against her skirts in silent comfort. The boy's trust, so hard-won over the winter months, warmed her heart. They had built something precious here, something worth defending. As evening settled over the valley, bringing with it the first chorus of spring peepers from the creek, Aiden broke their thoughtful silence. "If you wish to go," he began awkwardly, not meeting her eyes. Elena looked up from her mending, studying his weathered face in the lamplight. This man who had saved her with a golden nugget and a gruff kindness, who had given her shelter without demands, who treated her with a respect she'd never known. He was offering her choice. Real choice, not the false options her father had always presented. "I'd rather be poor and free than bought and safe," she said softly but firmly. Aiden's eyes met hers then, and she saw something new dawn in their depths. Respect, deep and true, untainted by pity or possession. He nodded, wordless, but that simple gesture carried more meaning than any flowery speech. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered outside. Tiva dozed, by the hearth, his dark hair gleaming in the firelight. Elena's needle moved steadily through the cloth, each stitch an affirmation. She was no longer the frightened girl who had ridden away from Silver Cross that winter night. She had found her voice, her strength, her conviction. The cabin creaked gently in the spring wind, solid as her newfound certainty. Whatever her father might bring, martial, territorial law, or mere threats, she would face it standing tall. She was Elena Creighton, daughter of the mountains now, and she had chosen her path. Through the window she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. They seemed brighter somehow, as if reflecting the clarity she felt in her heart. Her father's voice no longer held power over her spirit. She had found something stronger than fear. She had found herself. Aiden added another log to the fire, its warmth reaching out like an embrace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment, Elena knew with unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Not as someone's possession, not as a burden or a shame, but as a woman of conviction, standing firm in her chosen home. The night deepened around their little cabin, but inside, the light burned steady and true, much like the faith that had guided Elena through her darkest hours. She had emerged stronger, wiser, and finally, gloriously free. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks like a great purple bruise. Elena watched from the cabin window as the spring sky turned treacherous. The warm spell that had melted much of the snow was giving way to winter's last bitter gasp. Wind rattled the glass panes, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. "Storm's coming fast," Aiden said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Need to check the animals." Elena nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Take care. These spring storms can turn mean." Tiva looked up from his place by the fire, where he'd been practicing his letters. His dark eyes held worry as he watched Aiden head for the door. They'd all learned to read the mountain's moods over the long winter months. Outside, Aiden trudged through patches of mud and lingering snow toward the barn. The wind was picking up, driving the first wet flakes sideways. He'd seen storms like this before, quick and violent, the kind that could strand travelers or freeze cattle in their tracks. Best to get the animals secured and extra hay laid down while he still could. The mule snorted nervously as Aiden entered the barn, sensing the changing weather. He was checking the door latches when he heard it. Hoofbeats approaching, barely audible over the rising wind. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver. Through the thickening snow, 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Aiden's jaw tightened as he recognized them. Bo Creighton and Marshall Clay Hollis. They rode hard, clearly racing the storm. Inside the cabin, Elena was stirring beans when she heard the commotion. Her heart jumped at the sight of her father and the marshal dismounting in the yard. Tiva had already slipped toward his hiding place beneath the floor, well practiced in their safety routine. "Wait," Elena whispered, touching the boy's shoulder. "The storm. There's no time." Indeed, the snow was now falling so heavily she could barely see the barn. They'd all freeze if left outside in this weather. The cabin door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and her father's bulk. Marshal Hollis followed, snow dusting his badge. Both men's faces were red with cold and something else, determination or perhaps anger. "Proper grateful for shelter," Bo said with false heartiness, stamping his boots. "Ain't that right, Marshal?" Hollis nodded curtly, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior. Elena felt Tiva press against her skirts, trying to make himself invisible in the shadows near the hearth. Her father hadn't noticed the boy yet, too busy warming his hands by the fire. Aiden entered last, closing the door against the howling wind. The cabin seemed to shrink with 5 people inside, the air growing thick with unspoken tensions. Thunder rolled overhead, unusually loud for a snowstorm. "Coffee's hot," Elena said quietly, reaching for cups. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, but her voice remained steady. "Storm might last a while." "Mighty domestic scene," Bo observed, his tone turning ugly. "Playing house with a killer, are you, girl?" Aiden's shoulders stiffened, but he said nothing. Elena continued pouring coffee, though her father's words struck like physical blows. "Might as well get to it," Marshal Hollis said, removing his snow-covered hat. "McCord, that business in Rico, the mine owner's still pressing charges. Says you murdered his foreman in cold blood." "That's a lie." Elena's voice surprised them all with its firmness. "Aiden defended himself and others. He's a good man." Bo laughed harshly. "Good man? He bought you like cattle, girl. Ruined our family's good name." "You ruined that yourself," Elena replied. "Long before that night at Silver Cross." Thunder cracked again, and Tiva startled, bumping against a chair. Bo's head snapped around, finally noticing the dark-haired boy trying to blend into the shadows. "What's this?" Bo surged to his feet. "An Indian? You're harboring an Indian, boy?" Marshal Hollis's hand moved to his gun. "McCord, this is serious business, interfering with Indian affairs." "He was freezing to death," Elena cut in, moving to stand between Tiva and the men. "His family's camp was burned. Would you have us leave a child to die in the snow?" "Ain't natural," Bo spat. "First you shame us by living with this mountain man, now you're taking in savages." "Enough!" Aiden's voice cracked like a whip. He'd remained quiet until now, but something in Bo's words had sparked a dangerous light in his eyes. "You want truth, Marshal? Here it is. That day in Rico, the foreman was beating a 12-year-old boy for stealing food. The child hadn't eaten in days because the mine wasn't paying fair wages. I stopped it. The foreman pulled a knife. What happened next was self-defense, witnessed by 20 miners. The wind screamed around the cabin corners, emphasizing the silence that followed his words. Marshal Hollis studied Aiden's face carefully. "Those witnesses disappeared mighty quick," the marshal said, but his tone held a note of uncertainty. "The mine owner paid them off, or ran them out," Aiden replied. "But you know what kind of man he is, Marshal. You've seen how he treats his workers, Indian and white alike." Another thunderclap shook the cabin. Tiva whimpered softly, and Elena drew him closer, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. The boy's presence seemed to focus all the cabin's tensions like a lens catching sunlight. Bo's hand moved toward the revolver on his hip. "Law's still law. Can't have people taking matters into their own hands, harboring Indians, stealing daughters." "I wasn't stolen," Elena's voice rose above the storm. "I chose to leave, chose to stay. Every day I choose this life, because here I've found real family, not the shame and fear you gave us." Marshal Hollis's hand still rested on his gun, but his expression had grown troubled. "The boy," he said slowly. "His people? They were at Pagosa Creek?" Elena nodded. Hollis closed his eyes briefly, and she saw pain cross his features. "I was there," he said quietly. "Had orders to clear the winter camps. Didn't know they'd set fire. Didn't know there were children." The wind continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, something had shifted. Bo looked between them all, seeing his control of the situation slipping away. "Don't matter none," he blustered. "Girl's still my property by law." "No." Marshal Hollis's voice carried the weight of his badge. "No, she's not. That gambling debt was illegal to begin with, and McCord—" He turned to face Aiden. "Those Rico witnesses. Some might still be found, if a marshal went looking. Might be time for truth to see daylight." Bo's face purpled. "You can't mean to let them—" I mean to do what's right, Hollis cut him off. Something I should have done more of before now. He looked at Tiva, who stared back solemnly. The boy stays too. God knows we owe his people that much at least. Thunder rumbled again, but it sounded more distant now. The storm's fury was passing, though snow still fell heavily outside the windows. Elena felt tears on her cheeks as she held Tiva close, watching the men lower their hands from their weapons. "Coffee's getting cold," she said softly, and something like a laugh caught in her throat. Such a small, domestic concern in the midst of this storm of souls. Aiden moved to add wood to the fire. The marshal took a seat, removing his gun belt in a gesture of peace. Even Beau, after a long moment, slumped onto a bench, though his face remained dark with thwarted anger. They would wait out the storm together, this unlikely group, bound by truth's harsh mercy. Outside, the wind began to ease, as if nature itself had witnessed enough drama for one day. Elena poured fresh coffee all around, serving her father last. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something crack in his gaze. Not surrender, not yet forgiveness, but perhaps the first splinter in a wall of pride. Tiva emerged fully from the shadows, accepting a cup of his own. The boy's presence had forced all their secrets into the open, like spring floods bringing winter's buried things to light. There would be more storms to weather, Elena knew. Storms of law and conscience, of prejudice and change. But for now, in this snowbound cabin, truth had carved out a space for something new to grow. Thunder growled once more, distant as fading threats. The coffee's warmth spread through the cabin like a wordless blessing, thawing more than just storm-chilled bones. They sat in silence as the day's last light faded, each soul turning over the revelations that had broken like thunder in their midst. The lantern cast wavering shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls as night settled in. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing, its fury rattling the windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Inside, 5 people sat in uneasy silence, the earlier confrontation having exhausted them into a wary truce. Elena moved quietly around the small space, gathering bowls and what food she could find. The cabin's stores were getting low. They hadn't expected to feed 5 people tonight. Still, she had bread, some dried venison, and beans enough to make a meal. The familiar tasks helped steady her hands, still trembling from the evening's events. Tiva watched her with dark, serious eyes from his place near the hearth. The boy had barely moved since the confrontation, as if afraid any sudden motion might restart the violence. Elena gave him a gentle smile as she worked, trying to convey that things were calmer now. Marshal Hollis sat at the table, staring into his coffee cup, as if it held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. The lawman's face looked older in the lantern light, lined with something heavier than mere fatigue. Beau Creighton had taken the chair furthest from the others, his earlier bluster deflated, but his eyes still bitter. Aiden stood by the window, watching the snow swirl past in the darkness. His shoulders carried the same tension they'd held since the marshal's revelation about Rico, as if he were still processing what it meant for his life of self-imposed exile. Thunder cracked overhead, making them all jump. Elena nearly dropped the pot of beans she was carrying to the table. "We should eat," she said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "Storm's not letting up, and we'll all think clearer with food in our bellies." No one argued. She served the simple meal, and for a few minutes, there was only the sound of spoons against bowls and the storm's continued assault on the cabin. Tiva came, to sit cross-legged near Elena's chair, accepting his portion with a quiet nod of thanks. Finally, Marshal Hollis set down his spoon. His voice, when it came, sounded rough with emotion. Been carrying this too long? He said, not looking at any of them directly. What happened in Rico? It wasn't right. None of it was right. Aiden turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. You said the witnesses disappeared. They did. Hollis nodded grimly. But not the way I let folks believe. Mining company paid some off, threatened others. But I knew the truth. Had a deputy who saw it all, tried to report it proper. Next day they found him with a bullet in his back, called it a robbery gone wrong. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She reached down to squeeze Tyva's shoulder, needing the contact to steady herself. The foreman, Hollis continued, he didn't die by your hand, McCord. Mine guards killed him that night. He'd been talking about exposing the company's books, the missing wages, the corrupt officials they'd bought. They shot him and blamed you because you were already gone, already looking guilty for defending that boy. Aiden's hands gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white. Then I've been hiding from a lie, he said quietly, the words nearly lost in another roll of thunder. We all have, Hollis replied. Been hiding from the truth about Rico, about the mining companies, about how we treat folks different from us. His eyes moved to Tiva. About what we do to innocent people in the name of progress. Bo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Elena saw something change in her father's face, the hard certainty that had driven him here beginning to crack. The mine owner, he said roughly. He's the one who's been stirring up trouble about McCord all these years, keeping the story alive, feeding rumors. Because a guilty man makes a fine distraction from their own crimes, Hollis agreed. And I let it happen. Wore this badge and let justice rot beneath lies because it was easier than fighting the company. Easier than admitting what we've become out here. The wind howled mournfully around the cabin corners, as if nature itself were lamenting these confessions. Elena rose and broke more bread, passing it around the table like a peace offering. When she reached her father, their eyes met briefly. She saw shame there, and beneath it, something that might have been regret. All these years, Aiden said, finally turning from the window to face them. All these years in the mountains, thinking I had to hide to protect others from my guilt. Thinking God had turned his face from me for taking a life. His voice caught roughly. And it was all built on lies. Not all of it, Elena said softly. All eyes turned to her. The truth of who you are, that's in how you've lived since then. In mercy shown to a frightened girl at a poker table, in taking in a freezing child when others would have turned away. She looked around the table, meeting each man's gaze in turn. Maybe God's been working through all this time, all these lies, to bring us here, to this night, this storm, this moment of truth. Tiva stirred beside her, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. The boy reached into his shirt and pulled out something that glinted in the lantern light. A small carved piece of wood hanging from a leather cord. He held it out to Marshal Hollis. Sun Spirit, he said in his careful English. For truth-telling, makes the path clear. Hollis stared at the offered charm for a long moment before accepting it with trembling fingers. Your people, he said hoarsely. At Pagosa Creek. I was there following orders, but I knew it wasn't right. Past is past, Tiva replied with the simple wisdom of a child. New day comes. Bo Creighton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Elena feared he would react with his usual anger. Instead, he walked to the window Aiden had abandoned, staring out into the storm. Elena, he said, his voice rough. Your mother, she always said I was too proud, too sure I was right about everything. He turned back to face them, looking older and somehow smaller than Elena had ever seen him. Reckon she had the right of it. There's still time to change, Elena said gently, to choose a different path. Might be time for all of us to do that, Hollis added. He looked at Aiden. I'll set the record straight about Rico. Get statements from those witnesses who are still alive. Make sure the truth's known proper this time. And the mining company? Aiden asked. Their time's coming too. Got a federal marshal coming out next month, one they haven't bought. Between what I know and what others have been afraid to say. Hollis shrugged. Truth has a way of breaking free once you give it a crack to shine through. Outside, the storm's fury seemed to be easing. The thunder had moved off to the east, and the wind's howl had softened to a whisper. Elena felt the tension in the room shifting like weather, old pressures giving way to the possibility of clearer skies. She found herself reaching for the familiar words of her childhood faith. Shall we pray? She asked quietly. No one objected. Even Beau, after a moment's hesitation, bowed his head. Lord, Elena began, her voice strengthening as she spoke, we thank you for bringing us to this place, this night of truth. We ask for peace among us, for healing of old wounds, for mercy to flow where bitterness once ruled. Help us find the path forward together, in your light. Amen, Aiden murmured, and the word was echoed around the table. Tiva had curled up by the hearth again, his eyes growing heavy. Elena spread a blanket over him, smiling as he snuggled into its warmth. The boy's presence had been the catalyst for so much of this night's revelations. His need for shelter had forced them all to confront deeper truths about justice, mercy, and what it meant to be family. The hours crept past midnight. They talked more, sharing pieces of their stories that had been hidden too long. Beau spoke haltingly of his grief when Elena's mother died, how gambling and drink had seemed easier than facing his daughter's needs. Hollis described the slow poison of compromising with corruption, how each small choice to look away had built a wall between him and his conscience. Aiden told them about his daughter's death in that bitter winter, how he'd blamed himself for not being able to save her. Elena listened to it all, seeing how their separate paths of pain had led them here, to this night of healing. She kept the coffee pot warm, tended the fire, and watched as proud men learned to speak truth in the darkness. By dawn, the storm had passed. When Elena opened the cabin door to check on the animals, clean morning light spilled across the threshold. The world outside was transformed. Smooth white snow covered every surface, and the air held that peculiar stillness that comes after a storm, as if nature itself were taking a deep breath. Their lives, too, had been transformed by the night's revelations. As they prepared to face the new day, Elena saw how they moved differently around each other. The wariness replaced by something like respect, the old anger giving way to understanding. There would be more storms to weather, more truth to face in the days ahead. But something had shifted fundamentally, like spring thaw breaking winter's grip on the land. Tiva stirred by the hearth, blinking at the morning light. Sun comes, he said simply, pointing to the eastern windows where dawn painted the snow in rose and gold. Elena smiled, feeling hope rise in her heart like that morning sun. Yes, she agreed. A new day comes for all of us. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountain valley. The spring thaw had turned the trails to ribbons of mud, but they were finally passable. Aiden stood at the cabin door, checking his saddlebags one last time. His movements were deliberate, peaceful, a man who had made his choice. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart tight in her chest. The past weeks had changed them all, but none more than Aiden. The weight of false guilt had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet determination. "I'm done running," he said, turning to face her. His voice was steady, like the mountain peaks behind him. "Time to face what's waiting in Silver Cross." Let me come with you, Elena pleaded, stepping forward. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Aiden studied her face for a long moment. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in solitude. Finally, he nodded. Reckon you've earned the right to see this through. Marshal Hollis and Beau Creighton rode up as they were finishing their preparations. Both men had changed since that storm-racked night of confessions. Hollis sat straighter in his saddle, as if unburdened. Beau's usual bluster had softened to something more thoughtful. Tiva? Elena asked, glancing back at the cabin. The Ute elder from Bear Creek came for him before sunrise, Aiden answered. He'll be safe with his people now. They mounted up as the morning mist was burning off the valleys. Their small party moved single file down the narrow trail, horses' hooves squelching in the spring mud. Ravens circled overhead, their harsh calls echoing off the canyon walls. Elena rode behind Aiden, watching his broad back. She thought of the letter she'd found while cleaning yesterday, tucked carefully in his Bible. The paper was yellow with age, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. A confession written years ago by one of the mine guards, admitting their plot to blame Aiden for the foreman's death. She'd folded it carefully and slipped it into her skirt pocket, a testimony to truth that had waited too long to be heard. The day wore on as they descended from the high country. Patches of snow still lingered in the shadowed draws, but purple wildflowers were already pushing through the muddy earth. Nature itself seemed to be speaking of renewal, of life returning after long winter. Marshal Hollis rode up beside Elena during a rest stop. You understand what he's facing? He asked quietly. Even with the truth coming out, there'll still be those who want to see him punished. I understand, Elena replied, watching Aiden adjust his horse's girth. But hiding from lies was its own kind of prison. Sometimes the only way to freedom is through the dark valley first. They reached Silver Cross as the sun was setting, painting the weathered buildings in shades of gold and purple. People stopped in the muddy street to stare as their small group rode in. Elena saw familiar faces. The shopkeeper, the blacksmith, women she'd known since childhood. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to judgment to confusion. Aiden dismounted slowly in front of the courthouse, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk. Elena hurried to stand beside him, feeling the weight of the letter in her pocket like a stone. Beau and Hollis flanked them as they climbed the steps. Inside, the county judge was still at his desk, despite the late hour. He looked up sharply as they entered, his eyes moving from Aiden to the marshal and back. Your Honor, Aiden said quietly, I've come to set things right about what happened at Rico. Elena watched as understanding dawned on the judge's face. This was the moment all their paths had led to, a chance for truth to finally break through years of silence and shadow. She touched the folded letter, ready to present its testimony when needed. But first, Aiden would speak his own truth, facing whatever consequences might come, with the courage that had drawn her to him from the beginning. The last light of day slanted through the courthouse windows, painting them all in amber and shadow, as Aiden stepped forward to begin his tale. The courthouse fell silent as Elena unfolded the yellowed letter with trembling fingers. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. She cleared her throat and began to read, her voice growing stronger with each word. I, Aiden McCord, write this confession freely, though I acted in defense of another man's life that day at Rico Mine. The words poured forth, telling of corruption, of mine guards who'd killed the foreman and schemed to blame an innocent man. Marshal Hollis stepped forward when she finished, removing his badge and laying it on the judge's desk. Your Honor, I can confirm this account. The mining company bought silence with blood money. I've carried that shame long enough. The circuit judge leaned back in his creaking chair, studying the faces before him. His weathered fingers drummed against the wooden desk as he considered. Finally, he straightened, authority settling over his shoulders like a mantle. Based on this evidence and testimony, I hereby clear Aidan McCord of all charges in the Rico mine incident. The gavel struck with sharp finality. Beau Creighton stood in the shadows, his face ashen in the dimming light. He moved slowly toward Elena, years of whiskey and pride stripped away. Taking her hand, he whispered hoarsely, "You were always the best of us, girl. Always had your mother's heart." The town council, gathered in the back of the courtroom, pressed forward with offers of land and welcome. But Aidan shook his head, a quiet smile touching his eyes as he looked towards the mountains. "Much obliged," he said softly, "but my place is up where the air's clean, where a man can hear himself think and feel closer to his maker." Elena watched him, understanding blooming in her heart. In that moment, she saw not a fugitive or a mountain man, but someone who'd found his peace through faith and truth, just as she had found hers. Weeks later, the mountain air carried the rhythmic sound of axes and saws through the valley. Aidan and Beau worked side by side, their shoulders straining as they hauled fresh-cut pine logs toward the clearing where the Ute winter camp had once stood. Sweat darkened their shirts despite the cool spring breeze. Near the edge of the meadow, Elena knelt in the soft earth beside Tiva, showing him how to press corn seeds into the fertile soil. The boy's small fingers worked carefully, his face intent as he remembered his mother's planting songs. Elena hummed along with him, learning the gentle rhythm of his people's ways. A patrol of soldiers appeared on the ridge trail, their blue uniforms stark against the sky. Aidan's hands tightened on his saw, but he kept working. Elena touched the folded letter in her apron pocket, the preacher's formal sanction that declared their mission one of Christian charity. The soldiers passed without comment, their horses' hooves fading into the distance. Other settlers began arriving with supplies, women bringing baskets of bread, men offering tools and labor. Where there had once been suspicion, now grew understanding. They saw not an Indian child, but simply a boy helping rebuild his home. As the sun painted the western peaks gold, Aidan and several men hoisted a massive beam that would crown the schoolhouse roof. The carved pine timber would support both shelter and symbol, a cross rising above the valley. Elena watched them work, her heart full at the sight of former enemies sharing water and breaking bread together. She approached Aidan as he paused to catch his breath, a clean cloth in her hand. Gently she wiped the sawdust from his weathered brow. His eyes met hers, warm with unspoken meaning. In that simple gesture lay all their shared journey, from shame to dignity, from fear to faith, from isolation to community. The sound of hammers echoed across the valley, building something stronger than walls and beams, a bridge between two worlds, held together by mercy and hope. Wildflowers dotted the mountain meadow as summer wrapped the valley in warmth. Inside the newly built schoolhouse, Elena stood before 2 rows of eager faces, children from both settler families and Ute lodges sharing worn primers and slates. Her gentle voice guided them through their letters as morning light streamed through the window. "A is for apple," the children recited in unison, their small fingers tracing the shapes. A dark-haired settler girl shared her slate with a Ute boy, their heads bent together over the lesson. Outside, Tiva's laughter rang clear as he chased the strutting chickens around the yard, his previous sorrows softened by time and care. Aidan worked steadily at his carpenter's bench near the doorway, planing fresh pine boards smooth for new benches. He paused occasionally to watch Elena teach, his weathered face softening at the sight of her confidence growing with each passing day. The sound of hammering mingled with the children's voices, creating a melody of peace. When Preacher Morton's wagon rattled up the trail that afternoon, he brought more than just letters and supplies. His news from the Indian Agency spoke of treaties holding firm, of peaceful trading rather than rifles. Elena saw Aiden's shoulders relax at the words, years of tension easing away. As evening painted the sky in purple and gold, Aiden led Elena to their favorite spot behind the schoolhouse. Crickets began their evening song as he awkwardly lowered himself to one knee, his calloused hands holding out a simple silver band that caught the last rays of sunlight. "I ain't much for fancy words," he said softly, "but I reckon we've built something here worth keeping." Elena's tears sparkled in the fading light as she whispered, "Yes." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembled slightly. She covered them with her own, steadying him as she had so many times before. In that moment, beneath the vast Colorado sky, mercy and faith joined as one. Morning dew sparkled on the wildflowers as the Colorado sun crested the eastern peaks. One year had transformed the valley, where bare earth once lay. Grass now swayed in the breeze. The schoolhouse stood proud against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, its fresh-hewn timber weathered to a soft gray. Aiden's newly forged bell hung in its tower, crafted from scraps of iron he'd gathered through winter. The metal gleamed in the early light, a testament to patience and skill. Elena stood beneath it now, her hand steady on the rope as she sent its clear tone ringing across the meadow. Children's laughter bubbled up from the yard where they gathered for morning lessons. Tiva, who had grown tall and strong over the passing seasons, held a white dove in his gentle hands. His dark eyes met Elena's, and at her nod, he lifted his arms skyward. The bird took wing, sailing into the crystal blue heavens as the children gasped in wonder. Sunlight caught its wings, turning them to silver as it soared toward freedom. Aiden moved quietly to Elena's side, slipping his arm around her waist. Together they watched the mountains catch fire with morning gold, their peaks burning bright against the sky. Smoke curled lazily from the schoolhouse chimney, carrying the scent of pine and promise. Through the open windows, hymn voices drifted sweet and clear, settler and Ute children singing as one. Elena turned in her husband's embrace, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "You didn't buy me, Aiden," she whispered, touching his weathered cheek. "You freed me." Aiden's voice was rough with emotion as he answered, "No, Elena, you freed me." The bell pealed once more across the valley, its tone pure and strong. Each ring echoed off the mountainsides like ripples in still water, a sound of grace made flesh, of mercy answered, of love fulfilled in lasting peace. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.